Although Ares was known as the infamous god of war for thousands of years, everything changed in 2005. Kratos was named as the modern god of war by a well-known game franchise with lots of fans and a long list of accolades. Totally Awesome Geeks presents a special series revealing the story of the nearly 16-year-old franchise that redefined gaming and the individuals that made it happen. This is the story of God of War. Kratos, the protagonist of the God of War series, sits on an important gaming culture throne. He has appeared in several fighting games and is known for golfing in between killing his enemies. God of War helped PlayStation become one of the top-selling gaming consoles by selling over 25 million copies worldwide, thus achieving legendary status. Let's travel back to 1998. With the release of their first console, PlayStation, Sony Entertainment validated itself as a primary video game manufacturer. Sony was based in Tokyo, but as the Western markets began to grow, Sony bought European and American production studios. In 1999, they created the Sony Computer Entertainment Santa Monica studio. Their goal was to make fun games that sell. Their first attempt was Kinetica. It was Sony's first racing game and ultimately didn't sell. According to programmer Tim Moss, who worked on the game, it kinda sucked, but had good tech. We needed to make a big game that justified all the money that Sony put into us. Fortunately, a rising star in the video game industry came to Santa Monica Studios. That man was game tester turned video game director David Jaffe. Having already established a name for himself as co-creator of the Twisted Metal series, Jaffe came to Santa Monica to develop a franchise. One of the early ideas was an open-world first-person game, he reveals. We were calling it Dead Man at the time. It wasn't exactly survival horror, it wasn't slow-paced, but it was trying to do like an action-adventure set in the Louisiana swamps and bayou, about voodoo and supernatural powers. So the character would have these abilities and powers. Another one that didn't get as far came from us talking a lot about trying to create a way for gameplay to evoke some kind of emotion, as watching Lupin the Third, the one that Miyazaki did. How could we make a game that puts you in that same kind of feeling of high adventure? Those were competing for the longest time. But then I think it was ultimately Ken Feldman, who was the art director on all of them, who said that out of all these ideas, it was the God of War universe that we'd best be able to realize in a really spectacular way. That was when we finally said, it, let's go with this one. Jaffe had a goal, and that was to make a game that had a cinematic camera system and an epic story set in Greek mythology, inspired by such films as Clash of the Titans and Heavy Metal magazine. As a kid, I'd seen and read family-friendly Greek mythology, but I was reading Edith Hamilton to research a lot of this stuff before we went into development, and the stories themselves can be easily read to be very gruesome and violent. It was definitely a good fit. It wasn't like we were saying we wanted to do an ultra-violent Lego game. It was more about taking that mythology and playing up the angles that it was really violent, which seems to be something our audience really responds to. It was just having the awareness to spot that match and allow us a better shot at retail. Kicking off with the concept of, what if Paul Verhoeven had directed Clash of the Titans? I like violent stuff, that's why I said Paul Verhoeven in the original pitch. I like that fun, over-the-top, acrobatic violence in movies and games. But I remember being very clear about the fact that we'd have to make sure that this was brutal and intense, because if we didn't add that layer, it would look like you were just a dude running around in a helmet and a toga. But we changed that to, what if Ridley Scott had directed Clash of the Titans for the second document, because nobody knew who Paul Verhoeven was. The concept was approved, and David and a crew of approximately 45 development people began working on the first God of War under the working title Dark Odyssey. Noteworthy members included programmer Tim Moss, art and lead environment artist Ken Feldman, environment artist Stig Osmussen, game designer Todd Pappy, writer Marianne Krozik, concept artist Charlie Wen. We'd got a great lead animator at the start who'd work on the Lord of the Rings films. A quarter of the way through, we both realized he wasn't right. He was a phenomenal film animator, but the kind of animators we were looking for were guys who worked on fighting games, who understood animation, but who also understood the dance between that and combat. Barlog was then hired as a new lead animator. He brought to the table crucial fighting game experience, having worked on X-Men Mutant Academy 1 and 2. We originally started out with the idea of doing first-person Melee, so God of War was originally going to be first-person. It didn't get very far. We talked to some of the programmers about it and did a lot of research. Dreamcast had a game out at the time that was kind of the best in-breed for first-person Melee, called Makin' X. We studied that a lot trying to figure out if we could make it work. And GTA 3 had just come out, so we were kicking around the idea of open world. So yeah, it really was a broad initial conceptual phase while we were looking at this idea, and a couple of other things. And it just sort of evolved into God of War through a great deal of combat and fighting and yelling at each other. To avoid over-engineering, about 20 technical incline artists made up the art team. Creating all assets in Maya was perhaps the most critical decision. Art, collision, camera, entity system, everything was based in Maya, said Tim. To build new assets without a programmer, each team member had Maya as well as the latest game version on their system. Furthermore, an in-game tweaking system was included to allow tweaks to be made during play, saved to a disk, then included into the WAD file on the next build. The game would have the scale of Ico, and the combat system similar to Devil May Cry. However, most of the sources the team were referencing were third person. After we'd seen Ico, and especially Devil May Cry, it was like, I think we can merge these, said Jaffe. The visceral nature of Devil May Cry, with the puzzles and exploratory aspects of Ico, something backed up by Ken Feldman. Ico had just come out, and Devil May Cry and we, Feldman, Jaffe, and Moss, were fans of those games, and that kind of adventure. We wanted to take our studio in that direction. American McGee's Alice also helped formulate the initial idea. I worked at EA while McGee was working on Alice, and I love that idea of taking something people know, putting a twist on it, and delivering it to a modern audience. We heard a famous director of a Japanese action game say Western developers can't make good action games. Japanese developers just know how to do that. Western developers don't know how to do that very well. And Eric Williams, the combat lead on God of War 1, and I both said, challenge accepted. I think for the most part, we carved our own niche on that. One of David's game philosophies was to allow the player to constantly move forward with minimal backtracking, always introducing new environments and rooms. Jaffe says that God of War was intentionally designed to be simplistic and forward-moving, with a control scheme nowhere near as deep or complicated as its peers and competitors. We had to create so much content to keep the gamer engaged. God of War is not innovative or unique, and that's intentional. Our system was so shallow that it forced the team to constantly create new content to trapeze the player from one area of interest to the next. Just as challenging was creating the design of the protagonist. Initially, the idea was to design a character whose face would be obstructed with a helmet. I think it took us a year and a half to come up with Kratos. Everything has to be based around this character, the story, the weapons. The first guy we came up with was a little elf character. He was hysterical. His animations looked like Disney. There were other variations, like a blind monk with a baby, more traditional sword-wielding warriors, and an escaped slave. The slave had a more lasting impact as Kratos' blades grew out of one idea where the slave, Kratos, still had lengths of prison chains hanging from his arms. Jaffe's main idea was to create a very visceral, brutal character, with the unusual inspiration of Ed Norton in American History X, saying, "That guy, he really represents the brutal nature I want." That honed the look, and then, according to Jaffe, we just stripped more and more of his armor off until he was just this guy in a loincloth. The white skin, explained in-game as the ashes of his dead family, was simply the result of Jaffe liking a black and white illustration. The only color involved was in Kratos' famous tattoo, which was in the shape of Omega. It was blue because red was seen initially as to Rome, according to Jaffe. Blue just didn't seem violent enough, so red was chosen. Thinking of a character took a long time. Kratos could just as easily have been Dominus at some point. One of the 5 runner-ups chosen by the team. Kratos means strength, force, and sometimes violence. To voice Kratos, Terrence C. Carson was brought on board, a comedian from Living Single. No one had done a proper mythological adventure in quite some time, so it was reasonable that another would be announced while Sony's Santa Monica's Baby was still in production. I remember once, we were waist deep in development of God of War, and we saw a story online about a game. What the f*** that game called? It came and it went and it got horrible reviews, but to see it, and to see their concept art, and to read their PR, we just thought we were gonna be so dead. They beat us to the punch, those sons of bitches. Fortunately for Sony, this is the game industry, and not every title has the heavyweight credentials or the vision to turn a great concept into a great game. We saw it at E3 and breathed a sigh of relief. It wasn't all that great. Not to be disrespectful to the people that made it, but clearly they were hampered by budget issues. Whether he's referring to Rygar or Shadow of Rome or another game is irrelevant. We still see this kind of scenario today, but to a lesser extent since budgets for AAA games have increased exponentially, where lesser-known developers and publishers will find popular themes for upcoming hits and attempt to outrun their competitors. Perhaps the budget hike has actually helped, since that scenario has worked out so few times. We had days when we thought we were onto something, and days where we sat around figuring out what our next careers are going to be because we were clearly no good at this. An ambitious man, Jaffe constantly pushed his team to add more violence to the game. He even suggested that each door be opened differently. I don't want any two doors open the same way, which is pretty much the opposite of what programmers want, which is no special cases. There was a tremendous amount of pressure for the game to succeed. It was hinted at that the studio might close if this game was not successful. Tensions between the lead programmers Tim Moss and Dave Jaffe only worsened the situation. It was mainly due to their conflicting personalities, with Tim being a straight man and David's loose tongue. I kept saying that we had to have the environment go semi-transparent or we'd have to pull the camera too far back. And we wanted to keep the camera close so it was more dramatic. Almost every other game out there was making the characters and or the environment go semi-transparent. But you'd have thought I was asking him to go assassinate his parents or something. It was not going to be done on his watch. It was bad, and even to this day you can tell I'm still a little annoyed by it, because we could have had some amazing cinematic moments in that game if it weren't for the fact that the goddamn engine didn't support translucency. Fortunately, the tension was limited just to the job. Outside of the office, Tim and I got along really well. As release day approached, some content and ideas had to be cut. One example is that of Kratos' wings. He had stolen Icarus' wings in order to get through various obstacles. The original idea for climbing up Kronos involved Kratos running ahead of him and avoiding his attack until he could jump onto Pandora's temple. This was also cut. The Harpy boss is an enemy of God of War that also never made it into the final cut. The general idea was that the Mama Bird, which was the nickname given to the creature, would be encountered by Kratos while asleep, with Kratos having to steal her eggs and throw them into a fire, angering it. Kratos then would have to kill her so he could get to Pandora's box, which she was guarding. This idea involved Kratos moving through a maze with walls that would lift up and allow him to move onto a different part of it before the walls came down again. While many cut concepts were in the early stages of development, one idea that was cut was nearly finished. This was a moving elevator that Kratos had to chase and jump on again to reach the top. To ensure utmost satisfaction, the Santa Monica studio decided to set up a room to test each level. But the infamous underworld level with spikes was not tested. You were just supposed to get knocked down the spikes a little bit just so you wouldn't get stuck on them. You weren't supposed to get knocked off entirely. The problem is, it seems, was born of overconfidence. The coders promised they were going to deal with the collision on that. But what happened was, we had focus tested the out of that game. And it's a linear process, so by the time we got to focus testing Hades, which is where that area is, at the end of the level, we were just like, nah, we got it, we're good. It was literally the last level of the game, so we didn't focus test that one. And that was the one that bit us in the I regret that section, because it really was a shelf moment for a number of gamers. The game was based on Kratos, a character with a tragic past who swore a vengeance on Ares for tricking him into killing his own family. True to this concept, the game would be set in ancient Greece, featuring famous Greek gods and monsters, while taking major liberties. A small example would be other inclusions of Pandora's box, which in reality was known as Pandora's urn. Another major idea was Kratos killing Ares, thus becoming the god of war. In Greek mythology, there is a god named Kratos who helps to chain Prometheus to the rock as a punishment. The gameplay's mechanics were similar to Devil May Cry and Zelda as a hack-and-slash adventure with a mix of puzzle and platforming sections and popularizing the quick-time events. One of the game's most impressive technical achievements was the limited use of loading screens. Just like any other game, God of War has loading screens. However, the game hides those loading screens, usually behind an animation of opening a door or climbing high vertical stairs. It was a Herculean effort to achieve this. On March 22nd of 2005, the game was finally released to the public. The game had to compete with the release of Time Splitters Future Perfect and Dynasty Warriors 5, but all they could do now is wait. I remember thinking it was going to tank and be a disaster, but on the day of release, a friend of mine texted me to say there was a line out the door at the game store. I thought he was full of but there was totally this line out the door. By the end of July, it was the 6th best-selling game of 2005. By July 2006, the game had sold 1 million copies and earned $43 million just in the United States. Furthermore, God of War won several Game of the Year awards, but those accolades might have come at the expense of David Jaffe's health. It was a huge job. I gained 40 pounds on this game. I did irrevocable damage to my marriage. It was a stressful experience. It was a hostile environment. Part of that is what led to GOW being as successful as it was, but it was a real challenge. There were lots of nights where we were there until 3 in the morning, and those nights blended into other nights. There are people that you meet and you'd want to work with for the rest of your career. Then there are people that I have wonderful memories of, but won't speak to today. I can't stand some of them today, and some of them I think are just amazing. There are all these little moments that sort of add up to give you a recollection of an experience that, in my mind, was extremely hard, but extremely fulfilling and extremely worthwhile. We made something that we were really proud of. In spite of all the behind-the-scenes tension, David Jaffe delivered to the world exactly what he was asked for. The game truly lived up to its name, God of War. It would set the foundation for Santa Monica Studio for the next decade, giving birth to careers to many people who would go on to work on the gaming industry's biggest franchises. Now the only thing missing was an equally incredible sequel.